Okay, so welcome everyone. We're very pleased to have you with us this evening. I'm Kaylee Shannon Fiesel. I'm the Community Relations Manager at the Tiffin Seneca Public Library here in Tiffin, Ohio. Tonight's event is co-hosted by the library and the Heidelberg University English Department with the support of Brooks and Jean Warren Geckler. Their generosity with the Heidelberg English Department has made this series possible. Our special guest tonight is Dr. Ginny Badgett from the Boston Athenaeum. But before we turn things over to her, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Barry Devine. Dr. Devine is an assistant professor of English. He's been teaching at Heidelberg for 5 years and is a specialist in the works of James Joyce and Irish modernism. Dr. Devine earned his MA in Irish literature at University College Dublin and his PhD from the University of Miami. He's a contributor to the new Cambridge Centenary Ulysses, a 100th anniversary edition of Joyce's novel. So this is our third program in the John Quinn Lecture Series, and it began taking shape in the fall of 2020 when Dr. Devine reached out to the library about partnering to present a lecture series on Tiffin native John Quinn. So Dr. Devine, can you please tell us a little bit about John Quinn and his connection to the modern art world?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kaylee, and welcome to everyone. I see a lot of familiar names out there and a lot of new names, so I'm very glad you're here. Let me share my screen. Oop, I can't share my screen, Kaylee. I'm sorry, I didn't check that earlier.
Give me 1 second. Okay, you should be able to now.
Thank you. Here it is. All right. So I first came across the name John Quinn as a graduate student in Miami, looking into the manuscripts and drafts of James Joyce's Ulysses. Quinn was an American lawyer based in New York who defended Joyce's novel against claims of indecency by the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. These guys here. You can see in their newspaper ad and their logo that these guys meant business. There's a man burning books and a publisher or author being thrown in jail in their logo. The ad claims that the Society's lead inspector and U.S. Postal Inspector Anthony Comstock was once stabbed and that he was sent bombs and, quote, smallpox-laden rags, and he was not deterred. The Society used the U.S. Post Office and the courts to enforce their opinions about whether a book was indecent or salacious. Quinn defended the U.S. publishers of the Little Review, Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap, against such charges for publishing Ulysses in monthly installments. Quinn lost that case, but he knew he was going to lose before the trial started. He had been warning the outspoken Margaret Anderson for months. He did succeed, however, in keeping both Anderson and Heap out of jail, which was a very tall order. I began to see Quinn's name in more and more research regarding Joyce and other modernist writers like Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and Augusta Gregory. You see him here with Pound, Joyce, and Ford Madox Ford. Here he is with his friend and purchasing agent Henri Rocher and the sculptor Constantine Brancusi. More about both of them later. And here is Quinn with Rocher again, as well as Pablo Picasso. So Quinn seemed to be hovering in the background of the careers of dozens of modernist writers and artists in England, France, and Ireland. He seemed to be everywhere, arranging publication contracts and purchasing manuscripts, first drafts, and apparently hanging out with famous artists. A few years later, I was hired by Heidelberg University to teach modern literature in the English department. I moved to Tiffin, Ohio, nestled among the corn and soy fields, where I continued my research in British and Irish modernism. Quinn's name kept popping up over and over again, so I decided I had to learn a little bit more about him. I was very surprised to discover that he was born right here in Tiffin, Ohio, the same tiny town where I'm now living. I was also surprised to discover that he was as deeply involved in collecting avant-garde art as he was in collecting rare literature. Quinn was only an art collector for 20 years and only a serious collector for 13. In 1904, he began sailing back and forth to Europe, collecting paintings, sketches, and sculptures. And then he ramped up his collecting in 1911 and continued until 1924 when his health prevented further travel. During these last 13 years, he helped to introduce European modern art to American audiences who were not always receptive. He was a primary sponsor for the famous 1913 Armory exhibition, and he continued to seek out new artists, creating new forms of painting and sculpture. At the time of his death in 1924, his was the largest collection of modern art in the world. So what does one do with the largest collection of modern art in the world? If you're John Quinn, not a lot. He occasionally loaned out art for gallery exhibitions, but the majority of his collection stayed with him in his 11-room New York City apartment, making it available only to his closest friends. Art filled the walls and was stacked in the closets of his home, with the exception of his bedroom. His close friend, Jean Robert Foster, wrote, "In John's bedroom at the rear of the apartment, he hung only paintings by his sister and other members of his family, together with family photographs. His room was Tiffin, Ohio. The rest of the apartment was the world plus Olympus." He had well over 2,000 paintings, sketches, and sculptures. He bought over 50 paintings by Picasso alone, including this one now at a museum in Tokyo. I love this painting so much. And almost as many by Henri Matisse. He also collected sculptures by artists like Constantin Brancusi, Raymond Duchamp-Villon. This painted bronze sculpture by Duchamp-Villon is currently at the Cleveland Museum of Art, if any locals would like to go see it in person. In all, he bought pieces by 151 modern artists. Art scholar Judith Zilcher, who wrote a book on Quinn and tracked down much of his collection, notes that Cubism, Fauvism, Vorticism, and Synchronism were all represented in his hoard. Quinn had an eye for modern art at a time when the artists were fighting to be taken seriously, even among some of the art world. Quinn took them very seriously. The fact that this baker's son from rural Ohio eventually amassed such an impressive art collection is fascinating, but so are the ways in which he obtained it. He had two unusual practices for purchasing art that included legal contracts — he was a lawyer after all — and photography, and we'll get to both of those. Quinn started collecting art after becoming lifelong friends with the family of William Butler Yeats. Yeats' father John and his brother Jack were both accomplished painters, and Quinn bought many of their paintings. W.B. Yeats introduced Quinn to the Welsh painter Augustus John, who helped Quinn to appreciate more of the new experimental trends in European art. Quinn not only bought several of John's paintings, but he also agreed to pay John an annual subscription for more paintings in the future. This was basically getting first pick at all the new work that John produced. He would use this same unusual arrangement with other artists as well. In the early years of his collecting, Quinn swept through French art galleries, purchasing their paintings often in bulk. In 1915, he decided that with rare exceptions like Gauguin and Van Gogh, he would only purchase art from living artists. This new approach to his collection also changed the way he approached obtaining their art and gave rise to his second unusual method. Living in New York made it very difficult for him to make quick decisions about what to buy and what to pass over. So in 1920, he decided to have his good friend, painter, and journalist, Henri Pierre Rocher — here he is multiple times again — act as his agent and send him photographs of the art from Europe. And Quinn would decide whether or not to buy them based on the black and white photos and on Rocher's trusted assessment of them. Rocher was very enthusiastic about this arrangement and considered himself to be Quinn's hunting dog. He described how he felt about his job to Quinn in a letter. He wrote, "I have the impression of acting like a dog trying to chase out some big birds in front of you, and you shoot them or not, as pleases you." Quinn's biographer, B.L. Reid, describes the pleasure Quinn took in using a trusted agent to, quote, "stalk valuable and elusive prey with modest weapons and bringing back prime specimens by the exercise of taste, skill, and nerve." You can tell they both had fun with this arrangement. Quinn established a rule that he would only buy from photos the works of artists he already knew and whose work he had seen in person. Quinn liked this method better for assessing sculpture than for paintings, and so he relied heavily on Rocher's firsthand account regarding the quality of the paintings. In order to ensure that the photos were of the highest quality, Quinn and Rocher hired a photographer to capture the images for them. In the Quinn biography, Reed identifies the photographer almost dismissively in a parenthetical aside as none other than Man Ray. Man Ray was both a painter and a photographer, and by the 1920s, he was already famous among the artists and the gallery crowd. He became known more for his experimental and surrealist art photography than for his paintings, but he always considered himself a painter first. It seems strange to me that Reed would downplay the role of such a famous artist to this extent, so I'm a bit baffled by this. While this system worked for the three of them, Quinn soon developed a negative reputation among some art dealers and artists as, quote, the man who buys from photographs. Quinn relied on this relationship with Man Ray and Roche until he ceased collecting in March 1924. The final painting he purchased was Henri Rousseau's masterpiece, The Sleeping Gypsy. Quinn died from a recurrence of intestinal cancer 4 months later. Quinn specified in his will that his entire collection was to be sold at auction with the exception of a few pieces donated to museums. This meant that what was once the world's largest modern art collection is now scattered across the globe in museums and private collections. A former student of mine volunteered to do some research for me, locating some of Quinn's collection. Rebecca Marstaller, whose name I see here, hi Rebecca, successfully tracked down 38 of Picasso's 50+ paintings and sent me this infographic showing where they are. And they are indeed all over the world. I'll leave this up for a few seconds so you can appreciate Becca's hard work. And so that is a little bit of the background on Quinn and his art collection. And so I'll now turn things back to Kaylee at the Tiffin Seneca Public Library to introduce our very exciting guest lecturer, Dr. Ginny Badgett. Thank you.
Sorry, okay. So I wanted to, before we introduce the speaker, I wanted to recap the first two events. So the first event in this series was held in March of 2021, and Dr. Ellen Scheibel from the Bridgewater State University led a discussion on James Joyce's Dubliners. The second event in the series was held in June of 2021, and Dr. Gary Leonard, the professor of literature and film at the University of Toronto, was the guest speaker then. He discussed John Quinn's pivotal role in the publication of T.S. Eliot's poetic masterpiece, The Wasteland. And if you missed either of these events, you can view the recording on the John Quinn Lecture Series website, which the link will be in the chat. Now, I'd like to introduce this evening's guest speaker. Virginia Ginny Reynolds Badgett, PhD, is the Assistant Curator of Special Collections at the Boston Athenaeum, one of the most distinguished independent libraries and cultural institutions in the United States. She is an interdisciplinary scholar of American art and material culture of the 19th and 20th centuries with deep interest in biography and the history of collecting. Badgett received her PhD in the history of art and architecture from the University of California, Santa Barbara. She previously held curatorial positions at the Birmingham Museum of Art, the Detroit Institute of Arts, and the British Museum. Tonight, Dr. Ginny Badgett will analyze Quinn as a patron of the European and American avant-garde by focusing on key purchases and Quinn's influence on the canonization of modernism. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Badgett and turn the program over to her.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm gonna now share my screen. And we'll get started. Very good. So first of all, I want to take a minute and thank Dr. Barry Devine for inviting me to speak on John Quinn and collecting in the early 20th century. Thank you too to the Heidelberg English Department and the Tiffin Seneca Public Library. And finally, thank you to our audience tonight. It's truly a pleasure and an honor to be speaking with you. So let's jump in. And as you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and I'll look forward to probably answering them at the end of the presentation. But if they catch my eye, I might take a pause and address them as we go along. Since John Quinn's untimely death at the age of 54 in 1924, many of his friends, artists, collectors, curators, and scholars expressed concern about the sale and the dispersal of his collection of more than 2,500 paintings, sculptures, drawings, and other works of art. By 1924, Quinn's daring support of the avant-garde artists during his lifetime had yet to create widespread support for these artists, much less a market for their work. As a point of reference, in 1922, 2 years prior to Quinn's death, the Detroit Institute of Arts was the first public museum in the United States to acquire a painting by the post-impressionist artist Vincent van Gogh, who had died in 1890. Quinn purchased his own self-portrait by Van Gogh from the Parisian dealer Ambroise Vollard in 1912 and proudly lent it to the International Exhibition of Modern Art, better known as the Armory Show, in 1913. The Museum of Modern Art, which now owns 15 paintings, drawings, and sculpture once in the Quinn collection, would not be founded until 1929. Quinn's companion, Jean Robert Foster, summarized the fear of the uncertain fate of Quinn's collection in writing, quote, "The grief and shame of the few art lovers who knew Mr. Quinn's collection and loved it for its own sake as well as his will be unmeasured. If his life work is given to the harpies of the art game or tossed for a mere trifle to the art morons of America." As you can tell, she didn't have a lot of faith in the American public. So at the time of Quinn's early death, he was still at the vanguard of artistic taste within the United States. So how did John Quinn, a native of Tiffin, Ohio, come to amass the most significant collection of modern art in the United States by the time of his death? And how did his collecting philosophy change over time? Finally, how might we think of his collection, once intact, that is now either lost or dispersed around the world today? John Quinn was always a collector. His high school principal in Fostoria, Ohio, a man by the name of Dr. U.H. Squires, remembered Quinn's deep interest in literature and that Quinn collected first edition books in his youth. Quinn himself would later recall the early progression as a collector of marbles to books. He later wrote, quote, "I became a collector of books almost as soon as I ceased to be a collector of marbles and gave my marbles and bicycle away," end quote. Quinn's friendship with the Irish poet William Butler Yeats and his father, John Butler Yeats, provided 2 points of entry into Quinn's interests as a serious collector of both books and manuscripts, and from about 1902 onwards of art. And here you see a portrait of John Quinn and W.B. Yeats. On your screen now, you see perhaps the only painting in my lecture all evening that is not or was not formerly in the Quinn collection. So this is actually a painting by the American artist John Sloan, Yeats at Petit Pas. It's in the National Gallery of Art collection today. And you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but John Yeats is seated to the left side of the canvas, second individual in from the left with his cigar, holding court at a very popular artist scene and restaurant in New York. So all in all, though, while the Yeats really became the entry point for Quinn into the American art scene in the United States, Quinn was largely disinterested in American art. He collected a couple of etchings by John Sloan, had a painting by Patrick Henry Bruce, who is an American artist who took up Cubism very early on. But all in all, Quinn really focused his collecting interests on the European avant-garde. Quinn's interest in collecting art rather than books or manuscripts really began to blossom following a trip abroad in 1909. He wrote, quote, "I'm going to stop putting hundreds and in fact, some thousands a year into books. In fact, I've gotten my collections about complete and I am not going into new lines of book collecting. I'm going in for some good art, however. After all, a picture is a more living thing than a book. It represents life or a moment of life. And the older we get, the more interest we ought to show in life and less in a printed transcript of it." And this idea of art as living and vibrant is something that Quinn comes back to time and time again in his collecting and development as a collector. Quinn's collecting habits, as suggested earlier, compelled him to seek out a larger apartment in 1911 at 58 Central Park West, which overlooked New York Central Park. The ceilings were tall and Quinn filled a long corridor with bookshelves, floor to ceiling, to hold his library, which he estimated by that point ranged from between 6,000 and 7,000 volumes. His new apartment had 4 bedrooms and in theory, plenty of space for the occasional guest or servant. The spare bedrooms and closets, however, would soon be stacked with paintings. And despite a larger apartment, there was still not enough wall space to hang Quinn's growing collection. So he had a photographic memory and would shift things around in his apartment, pulling certain paintings to the front if he wanted to appreciate them and retiring them to the back of the stack in place of another work. So it's a very interesting way of living with your collection. In 1912, Quinn made 3 daring early purchases from the Parisian dealer Ambroise Vollard. A Cézanne portrait you see here of the artist's wife, Madame Cézanne, a Tahitian scene by Paul Gauguin, and also this self-portrait, which I referenced earlier, by Vincent van Gogh. The following year, Quinn would lend all 3 of these paintings, Cézanne, Gauguin, and Van Gogh, to the International Exhibition of Modern Art, or the Armory Show. The Armory Show remains one of the most important exhibitions in the history of the United States. For the first time, the American public at large was introduced to modern art, both European and American artists. The exhibition first premiered in New York between February 17th and March 15th, 1913. So almost exactly 109 years ago, before traveling to Chicago and then on to Boston. And Quinn was instrumental in bringing this exhibition to fruition. Quinn helped to secure the venue, the new armory of the 69th Regiment of the New York National Guard, which you see here. Quinn also provided legal counsel to the Association of American Painters and Sculptors, or AAPS, who organized the exhibition. Arthur B. Davies and Walt Kuhn were key members of AAPS, and both artists would become friends with Quinn and advise him on future art purchases. Quinn also lent 77 works of art from his own collection to the Armory Show, more than any other lender, and Quinn bought more from the Armory Show than any other collector or contemporary. One of these purchases you see here, André Durand's Window on the Park, which is now in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art, so MoMA in New York. And once you know to look for him, as Dr. Devine was saying earlier, John Quinn shows up again and again. He's everywhere in the ephemera of the Armory Show. So here, this is a photograph taken at the press dinner and delightfully annotated for us. You see John Quinn there in the red circle, sitting sort of two people beyond him is Davies, Arthur B. Davies, and then Walt Kuhn is on the far left there. And then he's also here. So this is the menu from that dinner, the press dinner towards the end of the exhibition. And John Quinn's signature is the the third one down by the arrow. So Walt Kuhn would later claim that it was he who convinced Quinn into buying work from the Armory Show. However, it seems that Quinn, with his voracious appetite for collecting modern art, may have needed a little affirmation, but ultimately needed little encouragement. Quinn also played a significant role in the publicity for the exhibition, writing, for example, an article in Arts and Decoration entitled "Modern Art from a Layman's Point of View." I'm not sure that Quinn could quite claim that designation, but he was doing his best to make modern art accessible to the broader American public. If the Armory Show introduced Americans to modern art for the first time, the public's hesitancy seemed to fuel Quinn's desire to acquire modern art and support the work of living artists. The show made a powerful impact on him. After one of the final days at the exhibition, right before it closed, Quinn wrote, quote, "When one leaves this exhibition, one goes outside and sees the lights streaking up and down the tall buildings and watches their shadows and feels that the pictures that one has seen inside, after all, have some relation to the life and color and rhythm and movement that one sees outside." So Quinn is making this direct connection between the energy and the sense of motion and movement and vitality of the pieces in the Armory Show to the very environment of New York City as this bustling modern metropolis. The Armory Show invigorated Quinn's collecting and commitment to modern art. In the spring of 1914, Quinn made his first purchases of sculpture by Constantin Brancusi at the Photo Succession Gallery of Alfred Stieglitz. After the Armory Show, Quinn slowly began selling books and manuscripts to finance his art collection. For example, he sold several manuscripts to Henry E. Huntington for his library, which became the Huntington Library, Museum and Gardens in San Marino, California. Beyond Quinn's relationships with his art advisors like Arthur B. Davies and Walt Kuhn, the poet and critic Ezra Pound seemed to have one of the biggest influences on Quinn's collecting. In January 1915, Pound published an article in The New Age decrying the impoverished situation of the British sculptor Jacob Epstein when American collectors were buying, quote, autographed manuscripts of William Morris, faked Rembrandts, and fake Van Dycks. Quinn, who read the article and had recently purchased work by Morris through his daughter, felt personally attacked. Could he be this collector that Pound described? He wrote to Pound, giving an assessment of his own collection circa 1915. He wrote, quote, "I have bought and own a fine Cézanne, a portrait of Madame Cézanne, one of the best Van Goghs in the world, a first-rate Gauguin, more than one painting by Derain, 3 or 4 fine Picassos, And here are a couple of Picassos that were once in Quinn's collection. So he went on to also call out the two important Matisses in his collection at that time. And a large number of lithographs and etchings by Matisse, paintings by Marcel Duchamp, and perhaps the largest collection of paintings by Augustus John in the world, and works by Americans, Walt Kuhn, Maurice Prendergast, Arthur V. Davies, Ernest Lawson, and other living American artists. He made sure to emphasize the living. And here, this is a painting by Marcel Duchamp that was in the Quinn collection. This is a study for nude descending a staircase, which you see here. So I'll toggle back. So this is the study for this piece. And nude descending the staircase number 2 on your screen now at the, well, they both are now in the Philadelphia Museum of Art collection. This painting, above all else, at the Armory Show really caused a stir and was cartooned by many artists or reporters. So it sort of became this iconic work of the Armory Show and the direction of modernism at that moment. With time, oh, and I also have, so Prendergast, who I mentioned, an American artist, one of the few in the Quinn collection, and then Arthur B. Davies. So with time, Pound and Quinn's terse correspondence became cordial, even friendly. Pound encouraged Quinn to support the work of living artists. Pound wrote, quote, my drive is that if a patron buys from an artist who needs money to buy tools, time, and food, then the artist, or then the patron makes himself equal to the artist. He is building art into the world he creates. Pound's ideas about patronage stuck with Quinn. In a 1920 letter to the Parisian dealer Vollard, Quinn articulated almost verbatim what Pound had shared with him 5 years before. Quinn wrote, quote, "To me, it is more interesting to buy the work of living artists. And besides, there is a satisfaction in feeling that in buying the work of living men and helping them to live and to create, one is in a sense a co-creator or participant in the work of creation, a feeling which one does not exist in regard to the work of artists who have passed away." So again, these ideas that Pound plants with Quinn in 1915 are surfacing again 5 years later and have really shaped and defined how Quinn is thinking about his approach to collecting and the artists that he is choosing to support. By 1920, Quinn's art collecting interest had narrowed significantly. He focused on acquiring the work of 3 sculptors, Jacob Epstein, Constantin Brancusi, and Raymond Duchamp-Villon, who was the brother to Marcel Duchamp. In terms of painting, Quinn focused primarily on the Parisian avant-garde, artists like Henri Matisse, André Derain, and Pablo Picasso. Brancusi was among the most represented artists in Quinn's collection at the time of his death. A look at the relationship between the artist and patron reveals how quickly Quinn found his footing as a modern art collector and how committed he was to the artists in his collection. Quinn likely first encountered Brancusi's work at the Armory Show in 1913. And Walter Pash first served as an intermediary between the two men. By 1916, Quinn commissioned a sculpture, a version of the Kiss in stone, now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And an earlier version of this had also appeared in the Armory Show. By 1916, Quinn had also requested first right of refusal for Brancusi's next significant piece. So again, this is something that we see him doing time and time again, building these relationships with artists, and then also finding ways to build his collection through those relationships. So Brancusi, perhaps feeling the pressure to produce something of merit, wrote to Quinn in June of 1917. He wrote, quote, "Concerning the refusal which you have of my next important sculpture, that is understood. Only I am sorry I cannot go quicker and that I am making you wait." Brancusi's Golden Bird is an important acquisition for John Quinn as a mature collector. From the wooden base to the tip of the bird's beak, the sculpture soars about 7 feet. Ezra Pound and Quinn corresponded about Brancusi. Pound wrote, quote, "Brancusi's maddening, difficult exploration towards getting all of the forms into one form. This is as long as any Buddhist contemplation of the universe or any medieval saint's contemplation of divine love. It is a search easily begun and wholly unending. And the vestiges are, let us say, Brancusi's bird." And you can see in this piece, Brancusi is using 3 different materials. So the bottom of the sculpture, the base, is made of wood. And then you've got 2 inverted triangles. Then that moves into a rectangular block. So all made of wood, but it's hard to tell in this image, but beautifully variegated grains. So he's thinking about materials and also shapes and form. And then you've got, again, this repeating motif of the triangles, and then the just exuberant bronze that's been brightly polished, forming the bird at the top. And it's really, there's really little distinction between where the base stops and starts in the sculpture, and that's really central to Brancusi's work, and seeing the pedestal as being really integral to the piece and not separate from it. So they're sort of all as one, but so delicately balanced between the forms and the shapes and the curves and the lines that he's using here. By 1924, Quinn's collection of Brancusi's works numbered close to 30, including 4 versions of the bird. According to Brancusi scholar Margherita Andreattoli, quote, "Almost every major sculpture by Brancusi produced during those 10 years that Quinn was really actively collecting modern art came into his collection." And one of Brancusi's works was in fact so heavy that Quinn wasn't able to make it up to he lived on the top floor of the building off of Central Park. He wasn't able to get it up the elevator or staircase. And so it was stuck in the basement of Quinn's building, but nevertheless, he acquired it. So really, even when sculpture was too physically challenging to move up to the top floor, it was still going into his collection. That's commitment. So Quinn was also always aware of his economic status as a practicing lawyer. Everything he spent on his art collection was money that he made through his law practice. Unlike other more affluent collectors, Quinn had to balance his interests and taste with his budget. He wrote to another dealer, quote, "I am a man of modest means and am neither a capitalist nor a man buying art generally. Buying art indiscriminately or the work of an artist indiscriminately is very much like catching fish in a net, only it is more expensive," end quote. Rather than lament his limited income, Quinn seemed to look at it as a puzzle to be solved. How could he collect the most advanced and highest quality art within his personal means? Due to the constraints on his time and inability to always travel abroad, as Dr. Devine mentioned earlier, Quinn often relied upon agents like Henry Pierre Rocher, who would advise him on art purchases and send him photographs of work currently on the market. However, Black and white photographs make it really difficult to judge the quality of any work of art, much less a work of modern art. As Quinn made more and more expensive purchases, he tended to buy the work of artists whom he was already familiar or had seen in a New York exhibition or gallery. In the spring of 1923, Quinn made the decision to sell his library collection, some 18,000 books and manuscripts. So if you'll remember, in 1911, his collection was estimated as between 6 and 7, and now 18,000. So he's still growing that collection too, in pretty dramatic ways, even if his passion is really shifting to modern art from 1911 onwards. Quinn spent many months of 1923 preparing for the sale, including producing a detailed catalog. And on the back of the catalog, he included a quotation from the will of Edmond de Goncourt, a French writer and literary critic. And it's a long quotation, so I went ahead and transcribed it here. So from the will, it said, "My wish is that my drawings, my prints, my curiosities, my books, in a word, all these things of art which have been the joy of my life shall not be consigned to the cold tomb of a museum and subjected to the stupid glance of the careless passerby. But I require that they shall all be dispersed under the hammer of the auctioneer, so that the pleasure which acquiring each of them has given me shall be given again, in each case to some inheritor of my own taste." Although Quinn's modern art collection was dispersed by his estate, his reaction to the sale of his library collections offer a precedent for his thinking as a collector in the year before his death. When a friend suggested Quinn's collection was a path towards immortality, Quinn dismissed any such thought. And Quinn wrote, quote, "I want to be classed with the alive, the living, the kicking, the fighting, the progressing, above all, the living." Quinn's final acquisition was Henry Rousseau's The Sleeping Gypsy, which he purchased in March of 1924 before succumbing to intestinal cancer several months later in July of 1924. Today, The Sleeping Gypsy is one of the most iconic works in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. Henry Pierre Rocher was instrumental in securing the painting for Quinn, who threw a dinner party to celebrate the painting's arrival in New York. Quinn sent an appreciative cable to Rocher, quote, "Wondrous color and composition, beautiful, moving, stupendous. Davies and others think it wonderful, most grateful for your efforts." In Quinn's own words, it was now the gem of his collection. And I want to conclude before moving on to questions with a book in the Boston Athenaeum Special Collections that I think provides us with a way to think about Quinn's collecting and the legacy of his collection. In November of 1904, on a trip to London, Quinn met Lucien Pissarro, the son of the French Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro. Lucien and his wife Esther owned and operated Ergnay Press, which specialized in fine printing and binding. Quinn was impressed by the output of the press and became personal friends with the Pissarros. Quinn subscribed for a vellum copy, what today we might call a deluxe copy, of each of the titles of the Ergnay Press published. This volume you see here, Some Old English and French Ballads, is one such copy printed in 1905. However, the binding is not original. It's been rebound by a contemporary bookbinder by the name of James Brockman. So you see it here, it's covered in dark blue goat skin with sunken pale blue panels, leather onlays, and tooled with 3 shades of gold and palladian leaf in a design that echoes the silver clip that keeps the vellum leaves together. And it is absolutely exquisite. I wish we could all take a moment and teleport ourselves to Boston and take a look at it in person. The book was purchased and added to the Boston Athenaeum's collection by one of our previous curators in 2008. So given, oh, and I have one more interior view for you here too. So it's a really, really exquisite book. There aren't a lot of illustrations. This is the only one, but very, very gorgeous binding and impressive volume. So given the volume's provenance, it's highly unusual to find a book of this nature rebound by a contemporary binder, regardless of the exquisite materials and craftsmanship. Oftentimes, whenever a significant ownership is discovered, you want to hold on to that and keep a volume as original as possible. However, clearly a different decision was made here with this case, and I haven't had a chance to connect with the bookbinder to get a sense of his rationale for this. But speaking as an art historian, this feels actually rather appropriate to me, knowing a bit about Quinn's ethos as a collector and his interest in ensuring that his collection stayed living and alive and fresh. Quinn was explicit in his desire for his collection to be a living, breathing thing, to be made continually relevant. And although some old French and English ballads found its way into a rare book collection, I think Quinn would approve of the binder's addition to this volume's history and to Quinns' legacy as a collector. Thank you. And I'm now happy to answer any questions. Or comments.
Before we get to questions, and that was fantastic, Jenny. Thank you so much. I was scribbling a couple pages of notes here as you were writing. That was so interesting. I just want to tip my hat to a couple people in the audience, primarily Aidan Ginty, who has been my student assistant this semester. I think you've exchanged a few emails with him. He is currently in the process of reading the John Quinn biography, The Man from New York. and I think is enjoying it as much as I have. It's very readable, and it won a Pulitzer Prize when it was published, and still so few people know who John Quinn was. And I see Kathleen Dixon Donnelly there, who she and I have been exchanging messages since the first John Quinn lecture, and I hope we get to do something together sometime very soon. So thank you both for being here. I appreciate you being here. All right, any questions? Oh, Kathleen has a question. I don't know if we can unmute you, Kathleen, or if you have to put that in the.
I unmuted me.
Oh,
Did I?
all right.
My Pittsburgh accent. Hi. Very good, fascinating. As Barry knows, I'm a huge John Quinn fan. And I was interested in what you said about Man Ray doing photographs in Paris. And I seem to remember from my voluminous research that when Man Ray was in New York, because he went to Paris in summer of 1921, but when he was in New York, he also took pictures to record what was in John Quinn's collection. And I think other collectors too, that they hired him to do that. So it was just kind of straightforward photography. Was that true that he did that in New York?
I'm not positive. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ginny.
I was going to say, so yes, I think that's true. I know I meant to mention this when I was presenting. There are no known photographs of interiors of Quinn's apartment, which I mean, the way it's described and how paintings and sculpture are just stacked and piled everywhere. I'm so curious, and I can't imagine living with that much art.
But Foster just had, I think after he died, wasn't she interviewed, and she had a very detailed description because she'd been there many times to his apartment.
Yes, so true, so true. And then there were some, so the Archives of American Art has a wonderful oral history collection, and a number of artists who were in New York in the teens and 20s and encountered Quinn had reminiscences about him, and trying to get into the collection to see things and take students there, and sometimes being allowed and graciously brought in, and other times turned away. So it's very interesting who Quinn decides to open his collection to, and who he does not.
Yeah.
But I think so the question of Man Ray and being dismissive of Man Ray's photography work in a documentary style, Reed's biography, I think I sort of that didn't surprise me as an art historian hearing that, because I think, especially when, gosh, I should know, this biography came out in 68.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Is that right? So there's still like photography at that point still, there's this constant friction between photography and if it's a real art form. That should have been resolved by 1968, but I think there's some like residual negativity around photography and its artisticness that's coming out through that classification.
Yeah, and so I've got kind of a follow-up question from Kathleen's question, Ginny. I know you visited the New York Public Library to look at the Quinn papers there. Were there any of the photos that Man Ray took as part of that collection? Did Quinn keep those? Do you know?
So I didn't come across any, and I don't remember seeing, I would have noticed them in the finding aid. I don't think they're listed in the finding aid. But that's an interesting thing to think about. And if I were on the hunt for those photos, I actually would go through probably although he wasn't working directly with dealers all the time, but I suspect if you're really looking for Man Ray photographs documenting collections, I would look in dealer papers first, because I don't remember seeing them in the finding aid, because I would have pulled them. I would have said, I want that box. Please bring it to me.
I was just so fascinated by that. Yeah, Man Ray's name only appears in this book once, and it's in parentheses. And I was like, how could that happen? Because I've known who Man Ray is for years. I'm fascinated by his photography. So I would love to see him doing basically grunt work for John Quinn, just taking photos of paintings. I really want to see those for some reason.
Well, it's interesting that comes up with Brancusi's work too, because he especially one of the sculptures I talked about, the Golden Bird, he's photographing it in different angles and like really thinking very conscientiously about how he is going to try to pitch this piece to Quinn through photography. So there's an interesting sort of intermedia aesthetic discussion happening there.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting that he got this kind of a bad reputation for buying from photographs, but the work that went in to getting the photographs and describing the art and getting that message to Quinn was really fascinating. It's just, he was such an interesting, strange guy. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Ginny and I are just gabbing here. We don't want to take time from other questions. If people have questions about Quinn, about any of the pieces of art in the collection. It's actually, I'm sorry, Kaylee, were you going to say something?
Either of you have a favorite from the collection?
Oh, do I have a favorite in his collection? So I think one of my favorite pieces is the Arthur B. Davies dances that I showed in the Detroit Institute of Art collection. And that's because I have a personal connection to that institution. I was a curatorial assistant there very early in my career, but I also, it's so unlike Davies, who often painted very mystical scenes. You know, it's Davies dabbling with abstraction and with cubism in a way that you don't see in other works. And I just think it also speaks to Quinn's relationship with all of these different artists. And one of the things that was so fascinating to me as I was doing more research on Quinn, he's also, I mean, back to this question and point of photography, you know, he's getting photographs with all of these artists that he's been corresponding with. So he doesn't meet Brancusi until 1921, but he's commissioning stuff from him as early as 1916. And then, they're photographs, and then he's being photographed with Picasso. And so I think that makes it that, it was 100 years ago, but, it's that sort of celebrity factor is still something I think we can relate to.
Absolutely. And we have a question in the chat. It's from Becca Barstaller, who did the research on the Picasso paintings. She says, was there anything you found interesting in your research that didn't make it into the presentation? Great question.
Oh my gosh. So much. So much. And I have to say, this is, I hope that I'll have a chance to continue this research because it's such an important period in American art, in art history in general, and this really transatlantic moment between American art and European art. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm personally interested in is Quinn's relationship with John Sloan, and how that, Sloan writes about, so this is actually a perfect example of something that didn't make it in. Sloan writes about Quinn and interacting with Quinn and the Yates, but, and hoping, hoping to sell art to Quinn, but that, that sort of materializes in a very slight way. He's able to sell some etchings, but, doesn't sell a painting, and he's really trying to establish himself in New York at the time as a painter. So, I think there's so many more stories to be told. And of course, you could look at I sort of did a survey of Quinn's collecting and some of the biggest hits, but you could do a deep dive into any one of these artists and their relationship with Quinn. Quinn is just such a fascinating individual with very defined tastes and attitudes. And I think, you know, it's pretty remarkable that he was so confident in those tastes and his approach to collecting. So I see we have some more hands.
Yeah, I want to take a shot at Becca's question first. I think one of the things I really wanted to get into my presentation were a couple artists that were not in Quinn's collection, because Quinn hadn't seen the work in person and was only looking at photographs. And even though Rocher was convincing him and begging him to buy the work of both Marc Chagall and Modigliani, he refused. And so he didn't have any Modigliani, who was one of my favorite modern artists, or Marc Chagall, who I'm not an art expert at all, but those are two names that jump out and stand out as being famous artists. So I'm very surprised that they weren't in his collection. That hand going up, Brian Smith, who is the Heidelberg University Provost. Thank you for being here, Brian. You have a question.
There we go. I do. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Barry. Excellent program. I'm really amazed and just in awe of Quinn's desire to leave a legacy of his collections being among the living. That's just fascinating and refreshing to me. But I'm nearly a lifelong Tiffonite. And so I was really struck by the description of his bedroom being described as Tiffin, Ohio. Were any of the artworks produced by his family retained, and were any of them of a quality level to be preserved and curated anywhere?
So that's a great question. I'll take a stab at it. And then Barry, I don't know if you've come across anything in your research. So I suspect he was thinking about those works in a different way. And I'm taking a stab at that, just thinking about how he's laying out the space and how he's putting that in his sort of like most private of spaces in his bedroom and keeping it really close to heart. I don't recall seeing any family members' names in the inventory of artists that I went through. And there have been a couple of art historians who've really delved into Quinns' legacy and collecting, and none of them address those works either. But that's such a great topic for a future article, because I think you're really pointing at something important here, that, you know, Quinn is he has artists in his own family, and so that's something. Art is not just something, you know, again, that speaks to living with art and being of art, and, you know, it being very personal. Some of the first paintings that he starts collecting are portraits. And I think portraits in general have that have an intimacy that other works of art don't, because you connect them with a friend or a family member. There's that personal connection. And so you're not, you know, it is about the art, but it's about the relationship, and something more ephemeral than can be communicated through a representation. So I'll stop there. Barry, do you have any thoughts?
I actually kind of went down a bit of a rabbit hole trying to find an answer to that question. And I was not able to find an answer, but I found some interesting things out, that when he died, he had two siblings who were still alive at the time. He had a sister in New York who was married with children. Most of the proceeds from the collection went to her and her family. She got the apartment as well in New York. And his other sister was still here in Tiffin, Ohio. She was a nun at the Ursuline College, which is now Calvert High School. And I couldn't find out whether, I think the painting was hers, or the artwork was hers that was in his apartment. But the only thing I could find out actually went the other direction, that Quinn actually brought her and Ursuline College one of the paintings from his collection, but I can't find out anywhere which painting that was or what happened to it. So hopefully I'll be able to see if I can get into the Calvert archives, if such a thing exists, and see if they still have that painting or if they know what happened to it.
There may be something. Oh, go ahead.
They may have sold it at their annual fundraising event.
Maybe not knowing what it was or who it belonged to. Absolutely. That's so interesting. And in the chat, Jenny, there's another question about Quinn wanting his artwork to go to collectors rather than to museums. The library staff person writes, I guess what I wonder is why Quinn referred to museums as he did in the quote that you showed.
So this is actually, I'm so glad that you're raising this question, because as a museum curator and such a big proponent of making art accessible and as widely accessible as possible, I think this very issue is one of the things that I came across with Quinn and went, oh gosh, like, you know, why weren't you more supportive of museums and public access to your collection? Because there's so many other things to admire about Quinn and just his tireless energy, both in law and collecting and everything he did, you know, to such a full extent. So I think, you know, that's a hard question to answer. I mean, Quinn I think this attitude sort of became more pronounced towards the last couple of years of his life. There was an exhibition at the Portland Museum of Art that he was asked to lend paintings to, and he sort of scoffed at it and said, well, why do I care about how art is understood or appreciated on the West Coast? You know, so there's this air of elitism that I think is a little hard to grapple with today, especially when we see museums as being such public spaces and philanthropy really following in that direction as well. So, you know, it's an interesting question, and kind of a difficult one. And I don't know if, you know, class politics may also play a little bit into this as well, and how Quinn's thinking about making art accessible or not. But great question, and one that I've been wrestling with myself.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so interesting that he wanted that thrill of the kind of the art of collecting, as he would call it, to go to one person rather than to make it available to the public so they could be thrilled. Just this summer when I was at MoMA, I had to wait in a kind of a shuffling crowd for about 10 minutes to get a good view of the Sleeping Gypsy. And it was just such a thrill to kind of see it. And as I was getting closer to it, knowing what it was and knowing how important it is. And then when I finally got to, you know, just kind of enjoy it for a few minutes, that's a thrill that I don't think he appreciated that people have. I think he didn't think that people like me who weren't art scholars could have that kind of appreciation for the art. So I think, yeah, that might have been.
Right. That's spot on too. You know, I mean, and you really get that sense from some of his comments, and then also Jean Robert Foster, her remarks too, that there was just a deep skepticism of when, you know, non-collectors and non-artists would catch up with the direction of modern art in the United States. And certainly we've gotten there. So that's right. A good thing.
Yeah, we're there now. Yeah, like you said in your presentation, the Americans weren't so appreciative of this collection in its early stages. Kathleen, you've got your hand up again. See if we can get you unmuted.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. I think you're right. And, you know, he's a lovely man, but in a lot of his letters, he was not like a man of the people. He was more kind of looking down on people. But I think he had some bad experiences with museums too. I think 1921, there was a big exhibit at the Metropolitan that he and another collector, Bliss, what's her name? That they donated.
Lillian Bliss, yes.
And it was all, you know, modern art. And there was this big uproar in the newspapers, you know, and there were all these people raging, how dare the Metropolitan Museum put this stuff there. And he wrote a counter piece, you know, in the paper about grow up. But I think he did have some trouble with museums and with people's reaction. So that might have led to him saying, you know, I'm not going to give them to them. Let's sell them off to individual people like me who will appreciate them, you know. I think maybe that was more of his attitude.
Yeah, I think so. And I think just as he became more and more of a collector and more of an expert, and in the last few years he was traveling, when he traveled with Jean Robert Foster, the two of them would kind of have like a dual offensive to try to get good deals on the art. By she would go in first and charm the dealer, and then he would come in with the, you know, with the money and the means to buy them. So it was interesting. It's interesting to think that they thought they knew better than the public about what was good art. That's so. Thank you for jumping in, Kathleen. That's really interesting. Cheyenne, you've got your hand up. Cheyenne's one of Heidelberg's students.
So I wanted to jump in on this discussion because it made me wonder about the origins of sort of this mentality that collectors should have sort of like almost a higher authority on appreciating art or something, because it's something that in my studies so far about just art in general, something that comes up a lot. Because I'm thinking of a time, for instance, there's a whole wave of celebrities even who have obviously money to purchasing art. I think of the artist Basquiat in the 90s, and recently Beyonce and Jay-Z, they have like this Basquiat painting that no one's ever seen before, and it was in the background of an advertisement for jewelry, and that's how the public first seen it. And I wonder about the origins of sort of collectors almost hiding the art away from the public, especially because like now I'm like, okay, there's a sort of pattern here. Like this isn't a recent kind of thing. It's kind of decades old, and I don't know how much farther it goes back. I just wonder about it.
That's a great observation. And I think, so not to delve too much into the history of museums and collecting and patronage, but public museums are really an invention of the late 18th century. So museums in general are sort of this new phenomenon. And I think really during Quinn's lifetime in the teens and 20s, you see this push towards this genuine push towards public access for a lot of museums. There's John Cotton Dana, who's the museum director at the Newark Museum, just outside of Newark, New Jersey, was a big proponent in the early 20th century in terms of museum accessibility and how do we define art. And he included in industrial exhibitions and showing craft and things like that. So thinking beyond the fine arts. But I think, you know, since Quinn's time and even before then, you see this tension, this push and pull between collectors who are willing to make their collections accessible and those who want to keep them more under wraps and for their own private viewership and appreciation. Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney is another collector in the early 20th century. She's slightly younger than Quinn, but she goes on to found the Whitney Museum of American Art, and her great grandfather, so the Vanderbilts, oodles and oodles of money, was also a collector and was one of the first in New York in the 1880s to open his collection to the public. So there's, at least going back to the 1880s in New York, this precedent for making collections accessible, even the collections of the very, very rich. And then this move towards founding public museums. But it's a great thing that you're picking up on and pointing out, because it's still happening today.
Yeah, and I think there's just this kind of natural human instinct to covet valuable things and to protect them. It's like Gollum with my precious. They just don't want anybody else to see them or have them. That, you know, you spent so much time and dedication and money on this really beautiful thing, that we want to keep it for ourselves. I mean, it's probably hard for collectors to part with them and lend them to museums for public consumption. I'm sure that just pains them a little bit. But a great question, Cheyenne. Cheyenne is an artist as well, so it's probably where this question is coming from. Let's see. Kathleen asks, and Barnes in Philadelphia, one of Quinn's competitors, I think he wouldn't let anyone in. Yeah. Actually, Kathleen, I have a question for you. For everyone's benefit, I attended a lecture online that Kathleen gave last month about Gertrude Stein and the art in her salon. So I don't know what became of Stein's collection after her. So what happened there?
Well, interestingly, you know, she and her brother were the crazy Americans buying everything up in Paris. And I do have somewhere, I think Quinn went to their apartment that had the paintings. At one point he went there, but they really didn't hang out together or anything. But some of them got sold off at one point during the war. Alice said, we ate the Cezanne, you know, because they had to sell them just for cash flow purposes. But then it's very sad, actually, when Gertrude and her brother split up, and he took some and she took some. But when Gertrude died in the 1940s, and she was sick in the hospital with her partner, Alice. And of course, there were no same-sex marriages in France at that time. So she had to leave everything to her nephew, and with a trust fund set up for Alice. But then not long after, the nephew died, and his wife was a bitch from hell, excuse my language. And they kept the trust fund for Alice, but she and Alice were just constantly fighting. And Alice wanted to have everything go as a Gertrude Stein collection to a museum. But Rubina, the hated widow, she said, no way. And she kept trying to get at the paintings. And at one point, Alice would go away on these retreats. And Rubina went in and just took them all and sold them off to a syndicate. And the only exception was the Picasso portrait of Gertrude Stein, and Gertrude had left in her will that should go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Gertrude did not believe in the concept of the Museum of Modern Art. She hated that. She said it wasn't modern art, it was art. You didn't have a separate museum for that. So that one went to the Metropolitan. And when the representatives came to get it, Picasso came over also, you know, just to supervise the wrapping and everything. And the museum people said, would you sign this? You know, that stating that it is Picasso's portrait of Gertrude Stein, and Alice went ballistic. Of course it is. What else would it be? She won't sign anything. So it did end up there. I've seen it. I think it has shown in the Museum of Modern Art, though. Gertrude is probably rolling over a bit in her grave. But the paintings were all gone. And you can imagine when you come back, when you take a painting off the wall that's been there a long time, how there's the outline. And that's what Alice came back to at one point. You know, her whole apartment was just filled with the ghosts, really, of all these gorgeous paintings she'd lived with and dusted. She always dusted them. So it was kind of sad, but they were sold off in a syndicate, which I'm guessing is similar to what Quinn did with, there was an auction, wasn't there, of his a while after he died?
Yeah.
Are dispersed everywhere.
And there were some private sales leading up to that auction too. And I thought that I had tracked down a couple of those works. There are some odd outliers in the Quinn collection. For example, at one point he acquired a painting. It was by Gilbert Stuart at the time. It's since been attributed to a different artist. But this is an early 20th century American artist. I can't figure out how and why, but someone talked him into buying it. And he doesn't strike me as someone who was talked into buying things he didn't want to very often. And then he had a painting by El Greco. So there, you know, and he also collected African art and Asian art. So the collection is even much more diverse than even European, you know, avant-garde paintings and sculpture. I thought of something else as you were speaking, and this discussion of museums and public access. So the one painting, there was one painting that Quinn gave and gave instructions in his estate to have given to a museum. And it was a painting by Seurat, and it went to the Louvre. So if you're going to say, you know, I'm going to donate a painting to any museum, like, why not send it to the Louvre? So he had a very high opinion of his collection, but he should also, I mean, it warranted it as well, as history has shown.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and when you think I'm going to donate to a museum, the Louvre is the museum, right? Actually, I have just a quick comment for you, Jenny, that your presentation helped me kind of place the research that got me into Quinn in the first place. Like I said, when I was in grad school, I was studying James Joyce's manuscripts. And one of them here, the blue books behind me, this is a collection of handwritten manuscripts that John Quinn collected directly from James Joyce. That Joyce didn't have a complete set of manuscripts, so Quinn decided he was going to compile one on his own, and just bought chapter by chapter as Joyce got them back from the typists. And he eventually collected almost, there are a couple of parts missing of individual chapters, but it's a nearly complete handwritten manuscript of Ulysses that is absolutely fascinating, because there are all sorts of things that hadn't been changed yet in this version. And this is the only way to access it, is because Quinn bought these and had them collected. But your presentation helped me realize why he sold it when he did. That he parted with large parts of his collection, and he sold it to, I think his name was Arthur Rosenbach. I'm not sure what his first name was, but he was the founder of the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. And so this is referred to now as the Rosenbach manuscript. But yeah, it makes absolute sense that he was willing to part with some of his more valuable literary assets in order to continue his art collection. So you helped me kind of complete the circle here with my research. So that was really fun. Yeah. Any other questions or comments for Jenny? I guess not. So I guess we will wrap up. I'll turn things back over to Kaylee to wrap things up. But just personally, I want to thank everybody involved. I want to thank Aidan Ginty and Becca Marstaller, and especially Jenny Badgett. This was such a labor, reaching way out of my comfort zone in terms of topics. So I really appreciate you being here and talking to us today.
It was my pleasure. It's so fun to join you and to talk about Quinn. And thank you, audience members. Great questions and discussion. Really enjoyed being here tonight.
So if you would like to learn more about John Quinn, we do have some materials in our local history collection that can be browsed at the library. So if you visit the information desk, our library staff will be happy to help you locate these materials. Thank you to Heidelberg University, the Department of English, and Brooks and Jean Warren Geckler for making tonight's event possible. A reminder that the recording of tonight's program will be posted on the Heidelberg website. So I just want to thank you all again for joining us this evening, especially Dr. Badgett, and we look forward to seeing you all at future events, both online and at the library.
Thank you, Kaylee. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for coming.